Ed, when you think about Steve's career and you work with him so closely at Pixar, why was he so successful?
Well, I'd have to say that over the time that I knew Steve, which is 26 years, which was just as he was forced out of Apple, that he went through, I'd say, some very distinct phases. And in the first phases, where he had a sort of a reputation, I think people misunderstood him and what he was doing. But what I found over the time was that he was learning from those mistakes. But the Steve, for the last several years that I knew, he was very kind, he was very empathetic with people, and when he negotiated, as I saw him do with Disney, there was the notion of fairness and partnership, which is very strong. And those things weren't there earlier, but he was so smart that he learned how to do it. When you test the boundaries, which some people do, and he was a person that did test the boundaries, when you do that, what do you do with it? Or let's take something which you hear a lot about, and it is CEOs would say, my employees are my most valuable asset, and the culture is extremely important. But with Steve, he built a building. And the building, I think, is one of the most extraordinary work environments I've ever seen.
You're talking about the Pixar.
The Pixar building. And this was Steve's design, and it was very cultural. And it was because he thought about what it meant to say that your people were the best and the culture was the best. And it translated into an environment that was unlike what other CEOs would do, who would use the same words.
He had a single-mindedness and an attention to detail unlike anyone I've ever seen. And if you look at he insisted on, and he was a bit of a control freak, you know.
He was?
A little bit, just a little bit. And he wanted to engineer every aspect of the user experience, let's say for the iPhone. Every excruciating detail he was personally involved in. I don't think people really understand. You know, Edison had this comment, you know, it's 1% inspiration and 99% perspiration. Steve was a god of perspiration. I mean, Steve worked incredibly hard. It wasn't just his intellectual gifts, which were enormous, but how he took that horsepower and applied it tirelessly until the entire problem was solved. I've never seen anyone like that.
But was there something different about his ability to focus, or was it this control freak thing, or what?
Well, I'll tell you, let's talk a little bit about Pixar. You know, and Steve was my best friend for about 25 years. I think we knew him for about the same, same length of time. Very interesting how we met. We were neighbors in Woodside, and his peacock wandered onto my property and woke me up. Not the way to start a relationship in a friendship. His girlfriend had given him a peacock, and I came over to complain about the peacock, said, you don't like that bird either. It's not that he just put in the hour. If he had to stay up all night, if he had night after night after night, he would call me up and say, Larry, let's get together. You know, we saw each other a lot. He'd come over to my house, I'd go over to his house. I said, Steve, I'm not coming over if you make me watch Toy Story again. I've watched 73 different versions of Toy Story. Now, I know the new version of Render Man is 4% better than the one I saw last week, but I'm not watching this thing again. So Larry, you gotta see, you won't believe the different the shadows look. But that was Steve until it was perfect. And then once it was perfect, and then he moved on to the next problem. But working obsessively until he had a solution that was insanely great is what Steve was all about. Ideas, there are a lot of good ideas.
There are a lot of good ideas in this room.
There are a lot of good ideas. Translating a good idea into a great product is unbelievably hard. But Steve would translate good ideas, not always his good ideas, but he would translate good ideas into finished product unlike anyone in our industry. You'd have to, Henry Ford didn't invent the car, but he made it cheap, and he made it popular, and he made it accessible to the American people. Steve would translate good ideas into finished, brilliant products.
And it's a thing I think that people don't understand about Steve, is that Steve was a master storyteller.
Storytelling.
He was a storyteller. And a good storyteller is working on, or one who makes up stories, is working on the components of it. And they'll try something new and they commit to it. So Steve would come up with an idea and he would commit to it. And he would roll it out to people. And for some people, that commitment would say, whoa, the great Steve has spoken. But in fact, what he wanted was the pushback. So people argue back with him, and if it didn't work, he'd go back and redo it. First of all, I knew his heart intellectually was in Apple. That was clear all along. There was something about that where he self-identified with. But he appreciated the passion there. But he was so brilliant, he knew the difference. He knew when he needed to be in it, because that was him, and he knew when he needed to support us. And because he knew the difference, he could succeed in both fronts, which were very different from each other.
Ed talked about him as a storyteller. Do you think that applied at Apple?
Well, I'd like to emphasize, one of the things Ed just said, which was, Steve did want to debate things. I mean, Steve didn't think it was important whether it was his idea or someone else's idea, as long as it was the best idea. Steve was definitely one of those people where the best idea won. Now, he had to, he's a very smart guy, and you had to be able to persuade him, but he would listen. If he thinks someone's better than he is in a certain area, he's very good at listening. If he thinks you're full of it, he'll tell you.
And it's phenomenal to watch him because he really would flip. And you just saw this. And he would argue something, and you had to have the force of will. But he wanted somebody to argue back.
Yeah.
He didn't respect somebody if they didn't have a point of view and push it hard.
He was a very inspirational, charismatic leader that people believed in. They wanted to be on his team because his team was doing very important things.
I think the Macintosh, which was so clearly far superior to what Windows was, didn't win because those other elements weren't there. And when I say Steve learned, because he had that genius, I agree there, but he learned those other skills, so by the time he got back to Apple, he was able to take the superior product and basically blow it forward because he was no longer weak in those other areas.
Yeah, no, I think he lost his job probably because he didn't negotiate with the board well enough. I mean, so I agree that he made himself vulnerable because he relied so much on what he did and how brilliantly he did it, that he expected the Apple board to recognize that he was kind of irreplaceable.
How would you advise someone who wanted to model the Steve Jobs career or the Steve Jobs method or the Steve Jobs success is basically what they want to model? What would you tell them to do?
Well,
I mean, it could be people in this room. It could be people who will watch this video.
yeah, I mean, to me, trying to copy Steve means they're going to stop at the surface. I think conceptually, copying Steve or emulating Steve is the wrong thing to do. Partly because some people are so unique that to copy them is only to parody them in some ways, in a way that doesn't work. And he truly was unique. And so you try to be like him, what does that mean? I do think there are principles for how you think about things, how you explore the boundaries, how you keep yourself from getting caught up in a conservative way of thinking, and the way you keep yourself from being blind from things. Steve had the facility to do that. Most people don't. And if they can work on their personal view of life and how they tackle problems and how they open themselves up, they'll have a greater result.
Well, I think you cannot copy Steve. I think you can ask yourself some basic questions if you're like him. I mean, if there's an unsolved problem and you're at work, can you think about anything else? If you want to know you're like Steve Jobs, it's very simple. You are unable to think about anything about these serious problems at work, and that's all you can do, and you obsess about it until you solve it, and then you move on to the next thing, and you obsess about that until you solve it, and then you obsess about this until you solve it. it is, that obsessive compulsive personality combined with this incredibly, and obsessive compulsive personalities are not all that rare among successful people. The obsessive compulsive personality combined with this peculiar genius of Steve's, which was both aesthetic. We talked about the building. He loved architecture and design. He loved. He was an amateur architect. He loved product design.
He wasn't an engineer, though. He wasn't a coder.
He wasn't a programmer. I'm a programmer, but he had enough knowledge of what went into into the product, whether it was the microprocessor or the operating system. He had a pretty deep knowledge about all of that technology. Very smart boy. He learned very fast. Might not have been a professional programmer, but his understanding of the complete system, the gestalt, the whole thing, the whole system, and how to fit those pieces together. If you have that kind of obsession combined with Picasso's aesthetic and Edison's inventiveness, then you were the next Steve Jobs.
So that's the test.
Easy. Yeah, easy. Yeah, this guy's not, when I use.
So there really are no lessons to take from it unless you take that little test and you match up.
No, I think there are a lot of lessons, but to try to model yourself after Steve Jobs. Again, it would be like, well, okay, what do I have to? I'd like to paint like Picasso. What should I do? Should I use more red? Apple became the most valuable company on earth, and it wasn't even one of Steve's goals. He never, he wasn't trying to be rich. He wasn't trying to be famous. He wasn't trying to be powerful. He was obsessed with the creative process and building something that was beautiful.